Hello and welcome to episode 161 of the Board Game Barrage podcast. I am Mark the Green Tank, and I'm joined as always by Nealon the Orange Tank.
Hello.
And Kellen the Red Tank.
Hello, hello.
Sometimes you try something and you find that you just don't like it. Not for you. And for the rest of your life, you think, that thing, black olives, not for me. I am not a black olive person.
Portugal.
Then, what'd you say?
Portugal.
Portugal is not for you? Sure,
That's
okay.
right.
Some people have black olives they don't like. Some people don't like Portugal. But then you check a book out from the library called The Lush Life of Portugal. Or you have a pizza with black olives on it. You didn't expect black olives, and you didn't even see as you were biting it that they were black olives. But hey, you just bit into some black olives, and they're not so bad. I love, actually, Clamato olives. I've always loved them. So this is not exactly an accurate representation of my stance on olives, but you get the drift. Sometimes there's things that you try, you don't like them initially, you think you're never going to like them again, and then your mind gets changed, and your whole perspective flips, and everything goes upside down. That's what we're talking about today, black olives and Portugal. No, we are talking about mechanisms that maybe you tried in a game, didn't like them, and then later on, you try the same mechanism in another game, and you're like, hey, it wasn't the mechanism's fault, it was that dumb first game's fault. So we're going to be talking about changes in perspective in mechanisms in board games. And a big thanks to Goose on our Discord, the Forest Tank, so he picked the right genre of color, for bringing up the topic and suggesting it to us, and here it is. And if you ever have topic ideas, you can join our Discord at boardgamebarrage.com/Discord, and I think maybe the feedback channel would be the best one to submit your ideas. We are always looking for new and interesting topics, so feel free to go there and give us your ideas. So that's our feature topic, but before we get into our feature topic, we're going to be talking about the games that we have just been playing. Nealon's going to start us off with Mr. Fister's CloudAge. I'm going to follow that up with Elizabeth Hargrave's follow-up to Wingspan, Mariposas, and finally, Kellen will close us out with Friedman Friesa's, what did you initially call it? Faiyum?
No, I did really bad. It was not a funny joke. I wish you would have cut it, but you left it in.
I mean, if I
and
find
then
it funny...
You schooled me and said, I'm from Faiyum.
I didn't say I'm from... I said family from. So yes, Kellen will be wrapping us up with Friedman Friesa's Faiyum. So Nealon, tell us a little bit about CloudAge.
So CloudAge is the latest game from Mr. Alexander Pfister. It is a Capstone published game. Those are two things that normally get us very, very excited. I'm quite a fan of a lot of Mr. Pfister's games, and Capstone in general, I think, have been on a roll. So when Capstone announced and started showing the art and the premise for CloudAge, it was something I was very excited for. One of the things I want to get out of the way right off the bat is I think there's been a lot of talk about how this is not a particularly heavy game. And, it's certainly not as heavy as I think the more recent prominent output by Alexander Pfister, but I do want to remind people that he has made excellent light games like Isle of Skye and Broom Service, so it's definitely not something completely out of left field. I don't think weight is its biggest problem, but I think I should talk a little bit about what CloudAge is before we get into that. So the premise of CloudAge is that you are an airship pilot in a sort of a post-apocalyptic world where everything is dried up and water is the most precious resource. So you start on one end of this sort of elongated map, and you are moving your airship across this map from one end to the other. It's not a race game, but the locations are getting sort of more and more rewarding as you get further to the right. So there's this element of wanting to progress. The resources you're acquiring along the way are water, which you use to play cards themselves, metal, which you use to make upgrades for your ship, because your little player board, which represents your ship, has little upgrade puzzle pieces around the edges of 3 different types. One which upgrades your movement, one section which upgrades your combat value, and one which upgrades your ability to plant seeds. So movement is pretty straightforward. That's generally how far you're going to be moving in a given turn. Combat happens whenever you enter a city, because you have to end your turn on a city. You have a little combat challenge there, which will give you different rewards based on how hard the combat is. So movement and combat are both fed in by a deck building element. You start the game with a little basic deck of cards, and you can acquire new cards which give you higher numbers to go into your deck in order to increase your movement, increase your combat. And then finally, this planting element, which is the third upgrade you can have, is kind of these it feels a little bit arbitrary, to be honest. There are these tiles you draw from a bag, and you can, at various points, plant them onto the map in order to get rewards and block out spaces for other players. But that's kind of the basic loop of the game. You are moving to a city, initiating a combat, getting a reward, using those rewards to upgrade your ship, get new cards into your deck, get new upgrades, and do all this better and better and better, move further along, get bigger and bigger rewards.
But Neelan, I've always wanted an airship.
Let me tell you, this is the game for you if you've always wanted to be an airship pilot. I think that one of the things that we have to talk about a little bit is there is this structure to the game, which is as a campaign game. This is something that Vista experimented with a little bit in Maracaibo. Now, I'm not super familiar with that implementation because I've not yet played Maracaibo, but I think by most accounts, people that engage with it tended to like it. It's not exactly a legacy game, but every time you play it, if you are playing through the campaign, you're sort of just introducing new little bits of story and flavor to make subsequent games more interesting. The way that this is done in CloudAge kind of grated me a little bit because in Chapter 1, you don't have all the rules of the game. In Chapter 2, you add one more rule, and in Chapter 3, you finally have what I believe are all the rules of the game. But none of those additions felt like especially interesting, and I kind of just wished I'd had the entirety of the game from the start. And I think that the thing I want to emphasize through all of this is that this feels more like a family weight game than I was expecting. I think that it's hard to justify the slow layering on of rules and sort of just like the reliance on the theme and the idea of the story and the campaign to carry you through, because ultimately I don't think that all of the mechanics really hang together. I don't think that any one of the subsystems in the game is especially interesting or leads to incredibly interesting choices. And worse than that, I don't think that the way that the whole thing coheres really justifies all of those pieces connecting together. It's a really hard game to talk about because I think one of the things that I admire about it is I do think the theme and the art is beautiful. And I do think it's a big diversion for Alexander Pfister to sort of do like a fantasy-esque theme. And the presentation is lovely. But I think that I was expecting something very different from the strategic totality of the game.
So this seems to be like a common, probably the most common complaint actually. Is it unmet expectations? Because like Broom Service, for example, is ultra light. Is this lighter or heavier than Broom Service?
It's heavier than Broom Service, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, no, it's heavier, I would say, than both Isle of Skye and Broom Service, in fact. So it's certainly not even the lightest game he's made. And I think that there's something weird about the middle ground even there, because it's almost too heavy. We've spoken about the way that someone like Reiner Knizia designs lighter games, right? And how they still feel like coherent and cohesive and like the rules are everything he needs to be and nothing more. This is like a step beyond that. This is kind of into that realm of middleweight games where you start to feel like, okay, now there's also this, and then there's also this, and then you can produce a little bit of stuff here, and then you have to like place your thing over here to do this. There's a lot of these little mechanisms, and they do all connect together. Like Alexander Pfister is a good designer on the whole, but I don't think that this particular design feels cohesive. It doesn't feel like everything needs to be there. I look at some of the systems in the game, and I'm just like, we could have taken this out, and it wouldn't have really damaged the game as a whole. But it just feels like more things to do.
And you mentioned that rules are implemented or layered on as you play like the first game, second game, third game.
Yeah.
Is there a suggestion in the rule books that says something like, if you are a advanced player, just start with the third?
If you're a board game podcaster,
yeah, exactly.
skip right to 15.
You know, like games like Taverns of Tiefenthal. Taverns of Tiefenthal. Will say, like, if you're an advanced player or if you think you're comfortable, just jump into the advanced rules. Is there anything like that?
So there is the lighter suggestion at the start of the rule book, you know, that says, like, for your first game, we recommend starting with Chapter 1. And I've definitely seen people in our Discord say, oh, probably just skip straight to Chapter 2. But I think that's kind of a weird suggestion when we're talking about a campaign game that's sort of slowly unveiling quote-unquote story. Because I also don't think that is a particularly strong element of the game, for what it's worth. And it also just felt like if I was going to talk about the game as written, it just felt like it made sense to play it in the order recommended.
Sure.
But I also don't think that the game that you end up at Chapter 3 unless there is something wild that's going to happen in later chapters, would be surprised if this is going to change substantially. There is one thing I kind of want to address, which is that I feel like listeners of this podcast know us well enough to know that we like light games, generally speaking. This is not a reaction to the game being too light. We've kind of spoken a lot about a game having the appropriate amount of rules for the experience it's providing. And this kind of feels like the end result, the decisions you're being forced to make, the game that you're getting out to the other end of it, doesn't quite justify even its kind of middleweight rule set. It feels a little bit like what you are putting into the game in terms of your investment in its systems doesn't quite get paid out in the experience and in interesting decisions. There are some cute systems in CloudAge, and I really wish that they were better executed. There's one system in this game that I haven't even spoken about yet, which is kind of like this visual puzzle, which is going to sound absurd, but like as you add cards to your deck in this game, they're kind of obscured by these sleeves that you put them in. And there's kind of almost this element of how many resources do I think this card is going to provide me when I take it, and then you pull out of the sleeve and you get revealed that information. So it's a little bit of this sort of like visual guessing puzzle. That is a fun, cute little idea, but injected in like what is ostensibly like a Euro sort of engine game, it doesn't really fit with the rest of it, you know, because you sort of are like, oh, I think I'm going to get 3 resources from this card. You pull it out and you get 1 resource, and that's frustrating and annoying because you needed those 3 resources. And I think that's just such a good example of like a slightly undercooked system that is kind of exemplifies CloudAge as a whole to me. Like, there's cute ideas in there. I don't think any of them delivers as fully as intended, and I don't think the design as a whole coheres as fully as intended. And I think that kind of sums up everything I want to say about CloudAge.
I think the last question and the most useful perhaps is just like, and I think I know the answer, but would you give this to Mark or I and say, give it a go, you may like it? And who would you give it to?
No, I can say with some confidence that this is not a game for any of the 4 of us. And I'm kind of almost even hesitant to like know who I would describe it for, because it's so specific. Like, I think if you had new gamers that are interested in the premise of like a story Euro game, I still think it would be a kind of a stretch.
Oh no.
It's a very, very niche-y thing. I'm glad that he experimented with it to try it. I think on the whole it's kind of a miss. But man, what a weird little thing. That's CloudAge.
So I got a chance to play Elizabeth Hargrave's follow-up to Wingspan. This is another flying animal product.
I think a bird game, right? According to us.
That's right, exactly. This time, instead of birds, you've got butterflies in her game Mariposas. So Mariposas is a quite light family-style game. Just out of curiosity, I wanted to compare its weight to Ticket to Ride, and it shows a heavier game, according to BGG, than Ticket to Ride. And I have a hard time reconciling that, because I think it's Ticket to Ride weight at most. So what you're doing in Mariposas is you are in charge of your gang of butterflies. It's a butterfly gang showdown. And what you're doing is you're flying around North America trying to
kill the other butterfly gangs.
That's right. You have to equip yourself with various weapons and then fly around to other butterflies and take them down. No, what you're doing is you're flying around North America over the course of 3 seasons. So there's a spring, summer, and fall season in this game. And every season you'll have goals that you're trying to achieve to get victory points. So one goal may be have as many butterflies as you can north of Atlanta, or have as many butterflies as you can surrounding Boston, so on and so forth. And the way this happens is you have a hand of 2 cards, and you pick one of them, play it, move your butterflies around, and then redraw at the end of the round. It's a very small, easy sort of decision space to figure out what you're going to do. Most of the spots on the board that you land on will give you a type of flower. Some will give you bonuses, specifically the cities. If you land on a city, you'll get a bonus. But most spots will give you a flower. And then when you go to other certain places, these milkweed, if you surround a milkweed icon on the board, you are able to reproduce and bring on the next generation of butterflies. So, you start with your first generation butterflies, then you have your second generation, third generation, and then ultimately, if you can, you have a 4th generation butterfly. The generation number doesn't affect the strength of the butterfly, quote unquote, the strength of the butterfly, but what you're trying to do in terms of getting them up from the 1st generation to 4th generation is actually quite interesting. This is an interesting aspect to this like sort of quasi race game. So it's a race game where the destination is where you started from. So what I mean is that at the end of the game, you'll score points for, the goals you've achieved, like if you've again gotten around Atlanta or whatever, all these other things, but you'll potentially score a bulk of your points by bringing fourth generation butterflies back to where you started, which is Michoacan in Mexico. So that's an interesting aspect to the game. So, you're moving your butterflies around and you're trying to achieve these goals, but in the end, what you're trying to do is also just get back to the beginning with fourth generation butterflies. So it's an interesting, race, not race in that respect. I found that sort of clever. Another thing that's sort of interesting in contrasting this game with Wingspan is, well, first of all, let's talk about the production. The production on this is not quite Wingspan level, but it is very nice. And I think this game is considerably cheaper than Wingspan, so that's a decent trade-off. The butterflies are these nice screen-printed wooden pieces, super, super colorful with all these flower icons and flower chits. So yeah, it's a very beautiful board and production. I think one strike some people have against Wingspan is the fact that you have less and less actions as the rounds progress. You lose one action per round. Mariposas is exact opposite, which I thought was funny. You get one more action per round. Spring you have 4, to fall you have 6. And speaking of the number of rounds, this game moves very, very quick. Played this for the first time, and after teaching it, I think the entire process took about an hour. So it's a very quick game. And one that I was pleasantly surprised by. It's, again, not super heavy, but felt like in the class of Ticket to Ride, a game that I would be super comfortable teaching to family on a holiday sort of thing. Given the simplicity of the rules, given the beautiful production, I think it's perfect for that family weight, play it once in the holidays or for get-togethers sort of classic game.
I'm in love with the way that this game looks. Every time I've seen pictures of it, it's such a stunning board, and what a lovely theme. Both with Wingspan and with Mariposas, I think the thing that Elizabeth Hargrave has done so brilliantly is bringing beautiful, unutilized themes to life in a way that I've just not seen before.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the way that the butterflies throw down is by getting to cities before other butterflies?
So that is a good point. There is basically no player interaction. The only player interaction, and this is, again, the most shallow definition of player interaction, is watching to see what people are doing and trying to make sure that you are in a situation where you could respond. But there is no blocking. There's no sort of hurting your opponent. There's nothing like that. There's just doing things better than they do. So that is not something that I would look for in a game at all. But for a game like this, for a game that I would pretty much only play with family or people who are not quote-unquote gamers, I think it's fine. And that said, I would even suggest playing this among the 4 of us. I don't think we're going to love this game. I don't think it's going to be crack our top 50, but I think it's just super pleasant and fast and fun. It's beautiful enough to look at that if you don't have a great time playing it, the 30 minutes you took to play it isn't a complete waste or anything. And that is Mariposas by Elizabeth Hargrave.
All right, moving on to the main course. Faiyum by one Friedman Friese. So this is the latest Friedman Friese game. I believe in North America, the only way you can buy this is on Board Game Geek right now. Faiyum is a very interesting strategy game set in ancient Egypt. The crux of the game, or the interesting part of the game, is that it is sort of a deck building game, except you are not cycling through your cards, but you are taking back into your hand cards in reverse order that you put them into your discard. That is, the first card that you play is going to be the hardest card to get back into your hand for the entirety of the game. It's literally, there are 3 actions in the game: play cards, buy cards from the market row, and administrate. And when you administrate, you get 3 cards back for free from your discard pile, and then you can purchase subsequent cards starting from the top going down for $1 per card. So the entire function of the game is acquiring new cards, figuring out where you want them in your discard pile, and then administrating and getting cards back. In a way, it reminds me a little bit of Forbidden Stars in the first in, last out, but it's not exactly that, because you do the action when you play the card, but what you're trying to do is you have a handful of 7 cards, and you do not want to play your best cards first, because if you do, it's going to be harder to get those cards back. Faiyum is a hexagonal board. It's pretty ugly. It looks like an old school Euro game. Christina looked at it and said, "This looks like a Euro game we played 10 years ago," which is pretty true, but it does have a lovely production. There's a lot of wood bits, a lot of different pieces. You are building a shared infrastructure. Everything on the board is shared by all players. So you're building settlements, you're putting workers on the board. None of those are yours. You're building towns, you're building little workshops, and everyone can use all of those in what is essentially a combo building game where you are playing cards to combo with other cards to score victory points. And then he also threw in the Power Grid auction, where cards are numbered from like 2 to over 100. And as new cards come out, the lowest valued cards go down into the marketplace. So the bottom 4 valued cards are the ones that you can purchase, but you kind of have a sense of what may be coming next. A lot of oddness in Faiyum. Very hard to talk about. I think part of the game felt very Splatter-like in the shared infrastructure and what you were building. You know, it's like you find a card in the market row and it's add a worker to a workshop and then get 3 victory points and $2. And you're like, shoot, there are no workshops on the board, but I just saw Christina buy a card that's going to allow her to make workshops on the board. So maybe I'll buy that and hope to exploit that combo later. Very hard to understand what is going to actually get you victory points in the game. There's a bunch of crocodiles on the board at the beginning, and every time you clear a crocodile, you get $1. So it's like, great, I'm going to start clearing crocodiles so that I can get dollars. There is a lot to love here and a lot of potential pitfalls. I do not think that this game is going to be for us. For one, the 2-player game is actually longer than the 3 or 4-player game because you go through the entire deck no matter the player count, and the cards exit the card row when someone administrates, and therefore you literally will go through all the cards 2-player or 3-player, except in a 3-player game there are more administrate actions happening. A lot of people online are already talking about removing cards in the 2-player game just to make it shorter. Our 2-player game took over 2 hours easily. Every card has a cool power on it, okay? Which you think, oh, Kellen loves cool powers, different ways. Okay, put a worker out on the board, develop a space, get some grapes, turn those grapes into roses. Oh my God, those are wild. Now there's victory points. Except there is a glossary of all of these cards. And literally, I cannot tell you how half or more of the game was perusing the glossary. In the want to make this multilingual, it has bad iconography. The iconography is decent, and this would improve with time, and a lot of the cards are shades of other cards. But when cards are shades of other cards, except, you really have to know what the except is in order to understand what you're doing. There's so much weird here. I would desperately want Mark to try it. I do not think it's good enough that Neelan would care to try it, but we should try it because it's interesting. The auction in Power Grid, that auction doesn't feel particularly screwy because everything kind of does the same thing, but just to varying degrees. In this, if a really good card makes its way down to the bottom sooner, it's going to have a bigger effect on the gameplay, right? And so every game is going to be the same, but where the variety comes in, the board is static, right? But where the variety comes in is when someone might get access to a power first. And I will say the criminal sin for me is that the most interesting decision of the game is what order should I play my cards in, and then how should I pull them back out? And I don't like making that decision. Me personally, it's not enjoyable for me for twofold. One, it's pay your money to get your cards back, and it's just like agonizing and not in a particularly fun way. And then once you have all your cards, it's how do I reverse engineer my entire turn and look at the market row and figure out what I may want to buy instead of playing cards. I don't know whether this game would be better with more players because you would have even less control of what's going on in the marketplace. It's so weird. Honestly, it's very weird. And I'm excited that I've played it, and I want you guys to try it. In general, there's another 2 little funny weird things that I just have to say. Here, let me read the rulebook to you. 2 funny things, and I read this sentence like 700 times. Shuffle the 56 blue bordered cards numbered 2 through 112. Now let me read that to you again. Shuffle the 56 blue bordered cards numbered 2 to 112. I almost quit. I almost quit right there.
It's room for expansion.
It is room for an expansion, but that's absurd to write it like that, Mark. And then the other part, and this part I love much more, is they introduce a fake NPC called Ronald. So if you're Ronald, you should feel really, really mad at this company because Ronald is that guy that asks questions like the entire game. So it'll explain a rule. They introduce Ronald, so it's like, use the action. You must use the complete action of the card to gain resources. And then underneath that in italics, No, Ronald, you cannot only use part of the action. If the action is to build 2 roads, you cannot only build 1. And literally, the entire rest of the rulebook has a bunch of no Ronalds. Like, it doesn't show Ronald's question, but it shows Ronald being berated by Friedman Friese.
I kind of love that.
So I don't know.
It's hilarious.
I don't know if Friese has always done this, but this is also in the rules for Fast Sloths. I think
really?
it's just becoming like a little gimmick of Friese's, and I hated it there as well for the same reasons. It kind of just felt like I was...
You were Ronald.
I've said something in this vein before, but I kind of felt like I was reading like a comedy bit while also trying to read the rules for the game and just being annoyed constantly.
I kind of liked it for what it's worth.
It's very silly.
It's very silly. Faiyum is infuriating. I don't know. It's too long.
Interesting, because you keep saying it's weird, and I feel like generally weird for you is good, is like a positive. Not necessarily like a glowing positive, but like weird is generally good. But you're saying weird shading to infuriating, shading to like frustrating.
I am concerned that the game devolves into knowing the flow of 2 through 112 and knowing when to administrate and how the end game works. There are cards above 100 that are quite powerful and engine combo-y, but the game continues until a bunch of natural disasters happen. And so when you administrate right before that and you get all of your good cards back in your hand, you're about to do a bunch of combos after the game has ended, and the scores are very close in the scoring. And then, it's kind of like that tempo of like, when do you do that final administrate? And it almost feels like that's the chief moment of the game.
Right.
And then, it's like a combo builder, except if you find a good set of combos, you're going to do that over and over again. Literally, you'll go 1, 2, 3, ba-boom, administrate. 1, 2, 3, boom, boom, administrate, and then it's the same. I love that the actions are play a card, buy a card, administrate. Boom, we're done. It's a song. Play a card, buy a card, administrate. Boom, we're done. Except, this glossary, it's like the entire premise of the game is buried in the glossary, which is no good. And I was imagining playing this on TTS with Mark, and I'm just like, oh dear God, should I print him out the glossary and ship it up to him, and then we'll do this? Because how is he going to do it? How are we going to do it? Maybe the cards have it on there. If so, play it on TTS. Very, very unique game. Too expensive, also. I do think you should try it. I have a feeling it's not for me. Well, I know it's not for me, ultimately. But that is Faiyum.
Interesting. I mean, I am interested to play it for the theme and also for like this weirdness is interesting, but I am expecting to not like it. I mean, there are a lot of Friese games that I don't like. Like I played Fire by him and Fortress, and obviously Power Grid are 3 of his games, and I didn't really like any of those. So sometimes he hits, sometimes he misses, but they're always interesting swings, I think.
Yeah, and it doesn't make me go, oh my God, I never want to try another Friese game.
Yeah,
again.
of course.
It's like, it was cool because I found roses are wild, right? And I got this thing that allowed me to place workers along the river and get roses. And then I got another card that let me double 2 resources in my array. And then I got another card that let me do my last card again. And so I'm over here, I've got 12 roses.
Sure.
Christina's like, what the hell is going on? You've got 12 roses. And her strategy is completely different. She's comboing off of building infrastructure, making these roads, and then moving workers back and forth along these roads, to the point that I started trying to remove the workers from the roads so that she couldn't continue with that stupid pharaoh mummy combo that she did. She beat me.
Cut that out.
But that was a fluke of the natural disasters. And that's Faiyum.
All right, so let's get into our feature topic. Mechanisms in board games that you thought you didn't like until you saw them implemented somewhere else and your mind got changed. Neelan, why don't you start us off?
Yeah, so one of the things that came to mind when I was thinking about this was how one of my huge barriers to a lot of games are games that sort of rely heavily on performative elements, or at least I should say this used to be a huge barrier of mine. And that sort of extends to charade-style games, particularly charades, something I've never really liked, the idea that you're going to get up in front of a group and perform this action in the context of a competition. And I felt very strongly about this for the longest time until I played Time's Up. Time's Up is the one version of these sorts of perform for your team charade style games that I really, really latched onto in a big way. And I can remember quite distinctly even the first couple of times playing Time's Up and just really being on edge because I was in a new group. This was in my first few weeks at our friend Dean's game night, in front of people I didn't know super well and kind of just feeling like I was on the spot a little bit. But there was something about the specific structure of Time's Up and the way that it rewards what has come before, and the way that it rewards aspects that are not purely just the performative guessing thing. There's a little bit of a memory component to it. There's like a collaborative component to it. There's a setting people up on your team for memory devices that are going to pay off down the line. And all of those elements combined to create a game where I suddenly didn't mind the performative element. Enough so that I actually really started to enjoy it. I can so distinctly remember like the first time I felt like I did crazy well in a round of Time's Up, where I sort of just knocked 10 things out of the park. And I remember like some of the clues, like one of the clues I formed was like Transformers the movie. And like it's so embedded in my brain, like going through the action, going burr, 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 and like doing the transformation. And that's not something I would never have felt comfortable doing like prior to that. But the structure of the game and how good, we've spoken at length about how good Time's Up is, but I think one of the things we haven't given it enough credit for maybe in the past is specifically how it counters some of the performance anxiety that I think is inherent in charade style performative games.
Neelan, has this extended for you beyond Time's Up at all? Like, because essentially it's the same problem I have with Pictomania. It's like you don't like performing and or you're bad at it. And I don't like drawing, and there's something, Pictomania works for some people because they're really good at one half, right? And Time's Up works because if you're just the smart guy that remembers all of the names of things, you actually get to contribute in a substantial way. And so it works if you know pop culture, it works if you're good at performing, and it works if you're good at being a memorization monkey. Are there any other like games with performative elements that you now are okay with, or is this really like Time's Up is like a gem?
It's funny because I do genuinely think it's Time's Up specific, because I'm suddenly reminded of not that long ago, and I want to sort of emphasize that I have also gotten better at this, just personally speaking. But like we played on the scale of 0 to T-Rex not that long ago, I would say like shortly before the start of the pandemic, and I still had that intense discomfort at doing anything in that game, to the extent that I was actually just legit bad at the game because I was unwilling to perform in the way that the game demanded. And I do think that Time's Up is something specific and special. Like, I think you're exactly right, Kellen, that it's because it allows you to participate, even if you're not good at the performance side of it. It rewards different strengths and all encompassed in the same game, that I think you start to enjoy the game despite the performance elements, and then you start to enjoy the performance elements because it's part of the whole of the game once you realize how well it's connected to the other aspects of the game.
I think that means that avenue is open. We need more party games like that. Let's do it. Make them. We'll review them. Okay, I will go next. Something that I thought as a mechanism that I always hated are action point mechanisms. So action point mechanisms are, broadly speaking, just you have 5 action points and do whatever you want on your turn, and each action costs a different amount of action points. This system has always struck me as intensely lazy. It's like, we're going to give them 17 different options of things to do, and then one of them, the most overpowered one is going to cost 17, and then we're going to work our way backwards, and then there's going to be 1-point actions. I am reminded of Flashpoint Fire Rescue. This is an old co-op game that I don't know if is still buzzing around. It was a pandemic alternative, except you got to be hot firefighters. And by that I mean both hot, and also warm as a result of the fire. Flashpoint Fire Rescue was a fine co-op game. It has a cool theme. Who doesn't want to be a hot firefighter? I went back and looked it up just to remember this, where it's like, change crew member, 2 action points. Fight a space without a fire, 1 action point. Space with fire, 2. Carry a victim, 2. Carry a victim under a ladder, 4. Up and down an elevator, 2. Around the side of the building, 2. Around 2 sides of the building, 4. Remove smoke, 1. Remove fire, 2. Operator engine, deck gun, 4. It's just like, I can't get over how annoying that is. Action points in general, I just don't like the system, and I think this is an example of when it goes all the way towards the end of what I dislike the most. But then I played Blood Rage. Now, I want to be very specific because I think Blood Rage is cribbed from itself, Chaos in the Old World, and then also copied by Mr. Sandy Peterson for Cthulhu Wars, my actual favorite implementation. But in Blood Rage, it uses an action point system where the actions mostly all cost 1, with the exception of summoning units, which costs the value of that unit to bring into the board. But what it adds is this real sense of tempo, where you must give up on the board all your ability to interact with it if you want to summon that big cool monster. And you're going to have to do it at some point. But the addition of that tempo to the action point system makes it come alive. When you go, ba-bam, I'm bringing out the Frost Giant, ba-bam, I'm bringing out my leader, and now I'm out of action points, and Mark's got 6, and he's going, bam, ba-bam, ba-ba, and he's ruining the board. Stop, Mark. Stop with your action points. For me, this is the best version of an action point system, something that I thought I did not like at all as a result of lazy design, in my opinion, and something that I feel like really works well in the context of tempo.
Your distinction between the two different types of action points, or two application of action points, strikes me as interesting. I remember playing the Kramer and Kiesling game Mexica, which has the action points sort of along the lines of Flashpoint Fire Rescue. I think it's done a little better with Mexica, but it is something that, although I was sort of okay with it, I did find other players who I played it with had issues with it, just didn't like it as a mechanism. But the idea that you use that reservoir as action points, not as a selecting off the menu thing, but as a consideration for tempo, is a really stark way of looking at it, a very interesting way to consider it, because it goes from being I've got X amount of dollars and here's my menu and I can get the filet mignon if I want, but then I'm out of money, to as you said, tempo thing. And I've talked about how much I love tempo, and the idea of bring out the big monster if you want, but I'm going to hit you with 1 point little guys and move them around the board as a compensation for that.
Yeah, it's a very precious thing that Cthulhu Wars and Blood Rage and Chaos in the Old World will do, of just looking around the table and thinking to yourself, what can other people do with their action points right now? And that specific dynamic of, well, if they do this, then they're out, and then I can strike with what I have, that it just injects so much more into that system.
And it's just, even having just a menu of here's the 5 or 6 actions you can do, something about it just feels lazy to me. And adding the numerical value in reverse order of how good the actions are, you can do small things that make me somehow okay with it. I think about Takanoko, which I think has 4 or 5 actions, and it's choose 2, but you can't ever choose the same one on a turn. I love that. I'm totally fine with that. But then, if Innovation had half of the actions in the game cost both of your actions that you get per turn, I would not like that. I would just be annoyed. And I think even Android Netrunner, right, has 1 action on one side that costs more of your actions. And it just feels like we couldn't get this balanced, so that one costs more.
When I first got back into the hobby, one of the first games that I remember playing was Nuns on the Run. I don't know if you guys have ever played that. It's a hidden movement game.
Hot Nuns, right?
What's that?
The firefighter.
That's right, exactly. Hot Nuns.
I don't know why all the people used to be so much hotter 10 years ago.
We got uglier as time went by. But it was a game I played way back when, and it was a game that I did not like. It's hidden movement, and a couple of years later, I remember when Specter Ops came out, and it was very hot, a lot of buzz around it. Another hidden movement game, played that one, did not like it. Did not like hidden movement. There's a couple of things I don't like. I think the biggest issue with games like this with hidden movement is the line of sight rules. I always find those annoying. Okay, wait, I'm hidden, but can this guy see me? Wait, let me see. Are we going from this point to that point? All this figuring out if you can see. There's also, when it comes to hidden movement, I don't really mind one against all games, but when it comes to hidden movement, when they're fiddly, it just, for whatever reason, bugs me. You got to figure out, first, are we doing the hidden movement rules right? Are we sure that everybody's on the same page with that? And then you add, okay, he's got this gun that can shoot this far away, and again, there's line of sight, and there's all these, things to consider. It just has always turned me off. But interestingly, I sort of had my mind changed about this when I played one of the oldest hidden movement games. This actually won the Spiel way back in 1983. I think the 3rd ever Spiel winner. This is Scotland Yard. Have you guys played Scotland Yard?
Nope. I think I have, but a very long time ago.
It's a very, very straightforward hidden movement game. One person plays Mr. X, who's like the bad guy, and you're running around the city just trying to evade until the time runs out or until you get caught by the investigators. And what I liked about it is just how straightforward it is. There are some rules. There is some rules depth when it comes to like the methods of transportation. So you have to figure out if you want to move by train or by bus or these 3 or 4 different types of movement. So it's not like the most straightforward, simple game ever, but it is very stripped down for a hidden movement game. I remember playing this with people who were not really into board games as much as I was, but teaching them was straightforward. We didn't have a lot of interruptions in play, figuring out like what could do what or who could see what, anything like that. It's very straightforward and just had a great time. It just sort of made me reconsider my distaste for hidden movement. As I've played other hidden movement games since then, I still haven't really liked them. We played Escape from the Aliens in Outer Space, and I didn't really love that either. Again, it was just like too fiddly for a game where the inherent mechanism feels fiddly to me. The whole like hidden movement thing just feels inherently fiddly, and when you add other rules to it, I find it distasteful. But I then played Jaws by Prospero Hall, one of these Target games, this new wave of Target hobby games. And it does hidden movement well. It's like, again, very straightforward hidden movement. You know, there's other aspects, again, there's other mechanisms. But the way it just handles it, nice and easy, I found refreshing, interesting, and again, made me realize that the way that I like hidden movement implemented in games is when it's done without a lot of other stuff, making it even more obtuse or complicated or fiddly. So, do you guys like hidden movement games at all?
I've got to say, Mark, I played a few of them, and I still don't think that there's one that I like all that much. And that kind of includes Scotland Yard a little bit for me. Like, I'd be curious to like dig into like what specifically it is about Scotland Yard, because the one thing that kind of always frustrated me about hidden movement is kind of this idea that there has to be enough leniency for the hidden player to like avoid detection, right? They can very rarely be in a position where the captors know exactly where the other player are, otherwise the game sort of disappears, right? I always feel like there's always maybe by virtue of that, and that was true, I felt a little bit of Sabotage and of Specter Ops and other games you've mentioned, but I also remember it being a little bit of an element of Scotland Yard, which is just kind of this feeling like, okay, at best we just have a 50-50 shot of like knowing where they went.
I agree with that, and I think the saving grace for Scotland Yard is it's like a 45-minute game. It's like a simple game. Like, it's way different than playing, like, you know, Fury of Dracula for 2 hours and then it being like a coin toss. He's either there or there, and who knows. Yeah, I mean, I don't even love Scotland Yard as it is. I think of the hidden movement games, it's my favorite, but that's not a very high bar at all. You know, it's probably a top 300, top 400 game for me. It's not anywhere near the top 50. But for hidden movement, it's quick, it's easy, and that's all I really want. Hidden movement.
That makes sense.
And again, it being added to a game like Jaws was proof to me that it didn't need to just be hidden movement simple. Like, you could actually have hidden movement in another game as long as you do it straightforward and simple, and it can highlight and add to another game. It just made me think that as a mechanism added to something else, I would potentially like it in some cases.
For the longest time, card drafting was shown to me through the lens of two things. One, Agricola. And the card drafting in Agricola is, oh, by the way, now that you understand this 2-hour complex strategy game, also draft all the cards at the beginning of the game for an additional 30 to 45 minute game. Oh, hell no. I am not doing that. And then in Seven Wonders, the other card drafting game that I was introduced to, there was always this element of hate drafting, which is this idea that, oh, you know, you either want the card, and so for those who don't know, card drafting is really simple. You pick up a hand of cards, you get to keep one, and then you pass the rest to your opponents, and then they have to choose the cards that they want. Seven Wonders is probably the most popular game that uses this mechanism, and hate drafting is the idea that you might take a card, not because you need it, but because you don't want your opponent to get it. And the thought of this just makes my eyes light up with joy. The idea that I could hate draft. But the reality is that Seven Wonders doesn't really give you the option to do it. And I know, before you hit me up in the comments and say, but you can build your wonder and hate draft with it. Yes, you can do that. But if someone on the other side of a 7-player game is building science and you get a hand of cards and everyone says, Kellen, you have to take the science card, or the multiplicative effect means that your opponent is going to win, like, that's not really what hate drafting is. And it doesn't work. And I don't like Seven Wonders enough. But But there are some games that have made card drafting work for me, and those two games are, one, Paper Tales is a fantastic card drafting game that allows you to do more substantive hate drafting. And the reason that that works is that you actually draft more cards than you could possibly play per round, and then after you have all those cards, you play a bunch of them. And so you don't feel bad about hate drafting because you literally won't be playing all of the cards that you draft. Amazing. Paper Tales is a great little game. The other game that made me reevaluate drafting was Inish. And rather than having this big, broad deck that even a game that I like Blood Rage, right, is like a drafting game, but hell, I'm not going to learn that whole deck. There's over 100 cards in it. Inish is 16 or 17 beautiful cards, very easy to understand, and you are drafting them. So you have a hand of 4 of them, and it's like, oh, I know exactly who's going to pick this up. It's going to be Mark, and if it's not Mark, it's going to be Neelan. And it's like, I know it's either going to be there or there, and I don't want the Geist in their hand. And so I must take it. And so the promise of drafting, which is like evaluating whether you need it and then looking at who might get it after you, is really, in my mind, just fulfilled only by Innis, or fulfilled by someone who plays the same board game 700 times and actually knows the deck and what the odds are. And so Inish, by reducing the card pool to 16, taught me that drafting can work, and Paper Tale showed me that hate drafting is in fact real.
I have yet to play Paper Tales, but I remember you talking about this when you first played it, the drafting aspect, the way that it did drafting well, and it's made me want to play it since you mentioned it. And you're absolutely right with Inish. Again, it's a game that I don't super love, but it's got a bunch of great parts in it, undeniably great parts in it to me, and the drafting is, like you said, it's brilliant. It's like the making an aspect of the game like simple and straightforward, and therefore like, whereas with a game like Blood Rage, it would take you, like you were saying, 50 plays to have that sort of like full knowledge of it, and therefore like engage with the game on the level that you ideally would. With Inish, you're there, you know, after a game and a half, and I thought that was always a brilliant sort of way to do that.
Yeah, I have mad respect for like what Inish does to the scope of the idea of card drafting. It's kind of like, well, take the unknowable and make it extremely knowable in a short amount of time and make that an integral part of the game of, okay, well, if I don't have this card, I know that someone at this table has the Geist, and that's what messed me up last round. I know that someone at the table has the card that lets them do this move and attack. You very quickly, by virtue of the cards being used against you or you using the cards, know what to expect in a given round. And this is even as someone that really liked drafting in very large card pools, like, you know, limited Magic the Gathering and that sort of thing. The way that Inish sort of takes a structure and like almost transforms it just by reducing the card pool is really, really quite cool.
I remain dubious of both card drafting and action point systems and think they're both kind of lazy, which I don't know what that says about me. It's like, oh, we have all these cards, we don't know which one is, you know, it's not, we can't let them just draw from a deck because some of them are better than others. We could draft them, you know, and so the amount of strategy games that now have cards where you just draft them at the beginning and then play the game is absurd. But I do think that, like all mechanisms, there are those shining beacons of what it can be or what it can do, and it's interesting to find those.
The second mechanic that I chose, it was player elimination, and it was so specifically in the context of social deduction games. The go-tos, I think, examples of this are stuff like Mafia and Werewolf, which are long games where you can get eliminated fairly early and are effectively sitting out for the remainder of the game. But I also experienced this, and have spoken in the past about my gripes with Shadowhunters, which is a game that I like a lot in premise, but then when you have those games where you're just out early through kind of no fault of your own, just because someone chose to attack you arbitrarily, and then you're just sitting out for the remainder of the game, that's pretty frustrating. And I kind of was always surprised when the Resistance came along and showed you, oh, you can make this sort of game without that. I kind of just thought to myself, well, that's it. Well, you solved the idea of even needing player elimination. One of the games I think that actually took player elimination in the very much the same vein, specifically as Resistance, is Secret Hitler. So Secret Hitler takes the core of Resistance and actually reintroduces player elimination towards the end of the game. And that might seem like a mistake, but one of the things that it really does, and I think that's quite striking, is the core emotion of player elimination is weight, right? This feeling that like, oh, if this goes wrong, you guys are going to be making a huge mistake. I'm not going to be here anymore to tell you how big of a mistake this is going to be. And cleverly, like, Secret Hitler introduces player elimination only towards the end of the game. Some of the missions, some of the fascist actions that you can take are only towards the end of the game and allow you to just straight up murder a player. And it's devastating. You feel like you're on the brink of like bringing the game together and pulling your team through it, and then you just get offed. But you don't have to wait around that long, because at that point you're typically 5 minutes away from the end of the game. It's such a smart decision. It's such a smart way to sort of take a kind of malign mechanic and reintroduce all the weight that comes across with it. Another game that I thought took player elimination and kind of did something really fun with it is Blood on the Clocktower. You're never out, even once you're killed in Blood on the Clocktower. You're still participating with your team. You're not eliminated in the way that you are in something like a Werewolf or Mafia. And in fact, the ghosts in that game even have this sort of final shot by using their one-off ghost vote, which they can, if they're pooling them smartly, drastically turn the game at pivotal points. I think both are really just smart ways to reintroduce a mechanic that just rubs a lot of people the wrong way and introduce it in a way that both feels relevant and crucial to the game.
I love player elimination. And people who speak about it as outdated are just dumb.
I understand the argument, and I kind of, for the reasons I've been laying out, like I do think there is a power in it. I just can't get behind the argument that it ever feels good to be eliminated from a game and not be able to participate in it anymore.
I think that the structure of how people play modern board games makes it so that a game with player elimination doesn't fit in. You know, it's like, we're going to get together for 4 hours on a night. That is not a denigration of player elimination itself, more as like, it's not intended for that type of moment. And in reality, like, stringing everyone along when you've actually lost the game after a quarter of the game is so much worse, because you're just literally wasting someone's time for over an hour and they don't even know it. And so all of our Euro games just hide and pretend like you might actually get it, when in reality you can't. You may as well have been murdered because you've just been for the last hour.
Get good. All right. So I'm going to wrap this discussion up by cheating. So I figured I was the host of the topic, so I got the chance to cheat a little bit. So I'm not really talking about a mechanism per se, but a sort of type of game, a sort of a new family of game. This is, quote unquote, the dice game version of a game. So an early game that I played that did this, and I think did it well, was Bang the Dice Game. I always preferred Bang the Dice Game to Bang, but I think in most cases it's not super great. There's Istanbul the Dice Game, which I think is inferior to Istanbul and just like a bad game in general. There's the hilariously named Viva Java the Coffee Game, the Dice Game, which I didn't enjoy very much. There are games like Kingsburg, the Dice Game, which I haven't played, but I heard is atrocious. This is a new the dice game that...
Are there no dice in Kingsburg? That's when it gets weird, right?
Oh, yeah. No, there are dice in Kingsburg. Yeah, this is Kingsburg, the dice game with more dice or less dice. I'm not sure how many the dice are. Even brilliant designers like Knizia with his Medici the Dice Game, as you guys sort of talked about a couple of weeks ago, you liked it to greater or lesser extent, but were generally, I think, middling. Even my beloved Biblios Dice, far inferior.
Oh, you mean For the King and Me, right? For the King, parentheses, and me.
Kellen, is this going to be a thing now? Every time I talk about Biblios, you're going to be referring to the upcoming implementation of it?
I've never heard of that first game, but For the King and Me, parentheses, is only $24.99 from Yellow.
Money well spent. Any version of Biblios is good money spent.
Maybe it should be For the King and Me. How fun.
But, speaking of the Doctor, I had my vantage point on this issue completely changed when I played Raw the Dice Game recently. Raw the Dice Game is by Knizia. It's an older game from 2009. Raw is a pure auction game, and Raw the Dice Game has no auction in it. So that may be one of the reasons why I think it's so good. It's not trying to be the predecessor. It is a push your luck, sort of Yahtzee style roll and lock game. And I just thought it was absolutely brilliant. I loved it. And so it is its own game. It's its own thing. And I do think that having played Raw and being a big fan of Raw made me enjoy Raw the Dice Game more because it shares some language with its older brother. But it just made me realize that sometimes these reimaginings, reconstructions probably is a better term for it, of standard games into these dice versions can be done in interesting ways. Whenever I see the dice game version of a game, I almost immediately discount it as being inferior. And Raw is like one of my favorite games of all time, and I think Raw the Dice Game is like fantastic. I felt myself getting carried away. I'm sure after multiple plays I would cool on this, but I was like, wow, this game might be a top X game for me. I don't know, top 50, but I just thought it was great. And I played it 2 players, and for like a push your luck game to be that great, 2 players really surprised me. So just recently having played Raw the Dice game made me think, maybe the dice games have something to them.
Was the shared language between Raw and Raw the Dice game screaming Raw at each other?
It was not.
Loudly?
It was not, unfortunately. But yeah, if you can find a copy of Raw the Dice game, I would highly recommend it. So that is going to do it for our show. Go to the Discord at boardgamebarrage.com/Discord into the podcast channel where we discuss the latest episode and tell us maybe some mechanisms that you initially weren't a big fan of, but then maybe changed your mind. And again, a big thank you to Gooseneck on the Discord who brought up this topic. As always, you can find us on all forms of social media. We're on Instagram, we're on Facebook, we're on Twitter. You know, every time I list these forms of social media, I start with no idea what I'm going to say, and just like I find Facebook, like it just like, and then Twitter just comes to me, and Instagram, like they just at the very last second pop into my head. It's always terrifying, but I always come through because I always come through.
You got zucked.
What's that? You say?
You got zucked.
You can find us at boardgamebarrage.com. You can email us at boardgamebarrage@gmail.com. Again, join the Discord at boardgamebarrage.com/Discord and submit your top 20 games of all time at boardgamebarrage.com/top20, and we will be compiling and using those top 20 games from listeners in a upcoming episode that we were very excited about. As always, a big thank you to Heart Society for our intro and outro song, What's on Your Mind, Kid? And until next week, that will do it. See ya.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Like even the microphone, right? If I tilt this a little more this way, then I'm like sitting at a different position.
Sure.
So let's just see what we can.
CloudAge by Mr. Fister. Did not hear it.
Nope.
I hear your beard.
Am I touching something?
I hear your beard scratching the thing.
I know that was on purpose. Come
I know
on,
it was.
Mark.
I know it was.
Okay,
I know.
people would love to be caressed by that.
I know. You're talking to
Christina.
Let's just play this. ASMR stuff.
Your ears gently caressed by Kellen's beard.
He just went from left to right, now from right to left.
Oh, wow, that sounds different.
Yeah. You
Now
gotta get that
across the mustache.
No, I like right to left better.
Just watching this, that's the worst part of all of it, to be honest.
All right, sorry about that.
All right,
No,
so
you're
just start the CloudAge thing in?
Yeah, sure.
My other addition to this conversation was going to be singing the Card Captors theme song, because Nealon used the word captors. Have you seen that, Mark?
I have no idea what you're talking
Card Captors, a mystic adventure. Card Captors, a quest for all time.
What is
this?
that?
It's an anime.
Oh.
It's really good. It's about this girl named Sakura, and she goes around getting the Clow cards, and it's like the death card, and then she has to like beat a monster, and then she traps it in like a tarot deck. And you can buy the tarot deck.
It's like a collectible card game she's doing, like a.
She has like a scepter, and then she screams, "Card Captors, a mystic." It's if you know, I guess.
Got it.